Hi guys, and welcome to my channel. Today I chose a different route to go for my video for my Framed series. I'm going to be talking about 5 people that were convicted and sentenced to death row, but they were eventually exonerated when the actual perpetrator came forth and confessed to the crimes. In 1959, Darryl Beamish, a deaf and mute man, was 18 years old when 22-year-old Jillian McPherson Brewer was killed in her flat. Her body had been mutilated with a tomahawk and a pair of scissors used to make dresses. And according to an investigator that was working on this case, Beamish had provided 4 confessions, 2 through sign language, 1 through a written statement, and 1 that was supposedly scrawled in the exercise yard at the prison he was located at. Beamish stated that the confessions were false and he had only confessed because he was intimidated and felt threatened by the investigators. Beamish had filed several appeals with the Court of Criminal Appeal and the High Court of Australia. However, all of his appeals had been denied time and time again. There was a serial killer at this time, Eric Edgar Cooke, who lived in Perth and had been questioned in relation to the Brewer murder in 1960, but he later confessed to the murder of Brewer on September 10th, 1963. Beamish filed a petition to the Attorney General. However, once again, his appeal was denied. And basically the appeal was dismissed because Cooke was unreliable, and ultimately they thought that he was just lying. And the evidence, according to the judge, was very strong against Beamish. However, after several failed attempts to appeal his case, his conviction was finally overturned in April of 2005 after he had served over 50 years in prison. Cooke, however, was sentenced to death by hanging despite his efforts to plead not guilty on the grounds of insanity. He was hung to death on October 26, 1964, the day he confessed to both of the murders. In 1963, 19-year-old John Button was convicted of the manslaughter of his 17-year-old girlfriend, Rosemary Anderson. She was hit by a vehicle and later died in the hospital. On February 9th, Anderson and Button were celebrating his birthday at his parents' house, but ultimately they had gotten into an argument and Anderson decided to walk home by herself. Button then followed her in his car, but ultimately she refused to get in, so he stopped the car, smoked a cigarette, and a few minutes later he continued driving to find her injured on the side of the road and she was unconscious. He immediately rushed her to a surgical doctor. I'm not sure why he went to a surgical doctor instead of an actual hospital, but the doctor then called the police and an ambulance. 22 hours after Button had been interrogated, he had confessed to the murder of his girlfriend after he had been physically abused by the officer and refused access to his parents for 22 hours. He had a stuttering issue as well, and police officers immediately took this as he was guilty and he was just stuttering because he was nervous, but that's just how he spoke. Button was sentenced to 10 years in prison but served 5 years. And once again, when Eric Edgar Cooke was arrested, he had confessed to the murder of Anderson and disclosed details that only the killer would know. But at this point, Button had already served his time for the manslaughter, so there really was no benefit from Button by Eric Edgar Cooke confessing to this crime. But Eric did commit a crime spree where he committed over 20 violent crimes, 8 resulting in death. His crimes consisted of stabbings, strangulings, shootings, and hit and runs. And although he was hung in 1964, he was not punished for the killings of Rosemary Anderson or Jillian McPherson Brewer because he had confessed to these crimes just 10 minutes before his execution. But he swore on a Bible that he committed these murders. On August 28, 1963, Wilbert Lee and Freddie Pitts were sentenced to death for the murder of Grover Floyd Jr. and Jesse Burkett. On August 1, 1963, Freddie Pitts, who was 28 at the time, and Wilbert Lee, who was 20 at the time, had gone to a Mojo gas station with a group of friends. I guess they were all hanging out that night. And Pitts and Lee had gone to use the bathroom, but discovered that the bathrooms were only for whites. This led to an argument between Pitts and Lee and Floyd and Burkett, who were attendants at the gas station. But 3 days later, Floyd and Burkett were found shot to death. A woman that was with the group that night stated that Pitts and another man committed the crime, but when the other man had a solid alibi because he was in the military and basically that was his alibi, she changed her testimony to blame Pitts and Lee. Shortly thereafter, Pitts and Lee confessed to the crime after they had both been beaten by the police and the safety of Lee's wife had been threatened. And eventually, both men were sentenced to death by an all-white jury on August 28, 1963. After several failed attempts to appeal their case, Curtis Adam confessed to the murders of Floyd and Burkett in 1966. This led to Pitts and Lee being pardoned and released from prison on September 20th, 1975, 12 years after they were sentenced to death for these murders. Curtis Adams was found guilty of a separate crime, and he's serving a life sentence for that crime, a crime that is similar to these murders, but ultimately he was not charged for the murder of these 2 store clerks. James Creamer, along with 5 others, also known as the Marietta Seven, were convicted for the May 7, 1971 murder of Dr. Warren Matthews, who was 69 at the time, and Dr. Rosina Matthews, who was 60 at the time. The murders took place in Marietta, Georgia during a robbery. It was a robbery gone wrong, basically. And in 1974, all 7 defendants were sentenced to life in prison when Deborah Ann Kidd testified that Creamer was the shooter. Kidd was an accomplice to the murders as well as an eyewitness. However, concluding her testimony, she was granted immunity for her involvement in the crime. She stated that she was high on drugs at the time of the crime and could not really remember what had happened, but eventually she was hypnotized and identified Creamer as the shooter. In 1975, the Atlanta Constitution found evidence that the prosecutor withheld from the defense team. They had found the tapes of Kidd being hypnotized, and in these tapes, the video clearly shows Kidd confessing to the murders. She openly admitted that she lied on the stand, and it was also later found out that she had a romantic relationship with one of the detectives working the case at the time. And eventually, in the beginning, when she had provided her testimony, like I said, she was granted immunity. So these factors really tore her case apart. Billy Burt, another death row inmate, also confessed that he was involved in the murders of both of the Dr. Matthews, but he also included that 2 other men were involved in the murders as well. The convictions were overturned for all 6 defendants once these people came forward and started confessing to the murders. They were released from prison on June 17, 1975. Alejandro Hernandez and Rolanda Cruz were sentenced to death in 1985 for the 1983 murder of Janine Nicerico, I believe that's how you say that. On February 23rd, 1983, 10-year-old Janine disappeared from her home where she was suffering from the flu, and because of that, she was home by herself. Her body was found 2 days later, raped and beaten to death. The only evidence found at the scene was a boot print on the front door of her home. According to several witnesses, Hernandez and Cruz had confessed to them and disclosed specific details of the crime to an investigator. After the trial, though, Brian Dugan, a serial killer, confessed to the murder of 10-year-old Janine. However, both men were still convicted of the crimes based on their confessions. In 1990, Cruz and Hernandez were retried separately. Now, for this case, I'm just going to be talking about the trial of Hernandez, but eventually there was no verdict because the trial ended in a hung jury. A second trial was concluded in 1991, which resulted in a guilty verdict, and Hernandez was subsequently sentenced to 80 years in prison. Because evidence that proved that Dugan had committed this crime was essentially withheld from the trial, and the jury never got to see that other side of the evidence. But in January of 1995, the conviction was overturned due to the fact that there was no physical evidence that Hernandez was at the crime scene or was involved in any way of the murder of Janine, except for just his statements and his confessions. But it was later proven that Hernandez was borderline retarded. So essentially he didn't understand his confession. He didn't understand, terminology or his sentence and things like that. So that's kind of where the borderline retarded fact comes into play. Some people just don't understand these things and they agree to it just because, that's what they were told and that's what they think is right. All charges were dropped in 1995, 10 years after both of the men had been convicted of the murder and rape of Janine. Dugan later pled guilty after evidence corroborated his confession, and he was sentenced to death by a jury in 2009. However, in March of 2011, the death penalty was abolished in Illinois, and Dugan, along with 14 other men that had been on death row, were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. That concludes my video for today. I definitely hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I really hope you enjoy this series. If you want to see more of this series, please be sure to like the video and comment down below. If you have any suggestions for future content, please let me know also in the comment section. I hope you guys stick around for part 2, and with that, I'll see you guys in my next video.